Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the next Geary Institute for Public Policy Tuesday seminar. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Mike Simmons from Royal Holloway, University of London. He's a teaching fellow in economics and successfully completed his PhD last week. Mike's research interests are in labour economics and macroeconomics. He's also an associate at the Centre for Microeconomics and Labour at RHUL. So today, Mike is going to be presenting a seminar to us on the ins and outs of the gender unemployment gap in the OECD. And as we do every week, we will take questions through the Q&A format of the webinar. So without further ado, Mike, over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to present at the Geary Institute. It's great. It's a pleasure to be able to present to you all. Yeah, so over the next sort of 40 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking to you about job loss and job finding, two of the most fundamental aspects of labour markets, but focusing on the gender aspect. And in particular, what I'm going to be thinking about is why is it the case that one gender has a more volatile unemployment rate than the other? There's actually interesting differences that we see in the current recession, but in the past, it seems to be that one gender, and this is consistent across many countries, one gender experiences greater increases in unemployment during recessions relative to the other. Okay, so this work is with Raymond Lydon, and it's titled The Ins and Outs of the Gender Unemployment Gap in the OECD. Okay, so what I want to begin with is just the basic description of the labour market. So we have, let's keep it a two-state world, so it's just employment and unemployment, and what happens is many workers flow between these two states. And so this is described as the the flows approach to labour markets. Okay, and so many workers flow from employment to unemployment, so this is described as separation, so S here. You can think of this, in reality, this should be thought of as unemployment inflows. I'm going to be interchanging between separations and unemployment inflows, and also job finding and unemployment outflows. And to be accurate, I should be talking about these unemployment inflows and outflows, but when I say job finding and job separations, this is basically the transition I'm talking about. Okay, so there's a labour market, and many workers are flowing between these states. Using this flows-based approach, there's been a large literature that's wanted to understand why is it the case that the unemployment rate rises in recessions and falls in expansions. Is it due to increases in separations? Is it due to predominantly increases in separations in recessions? Or is it due to predominantly reductions in job finding? Now, which of these margins is most important plausibly tells us some interesting features of labour markets, and tells us in particular how labour markets respond when recessions hit. And this is maybe really important for policy analysis. Which of these margins is most important? Is it just due to an increase in job destruction in recessions, i.e. increased separations, or does unemployment rise because of reductions in vacancy creation, or the analogous is reductions in job finding? So what's the answer to these questions that literature has found? So in the US, what we tend to find is that job finding seems to be most important. So fluctuations in vacancy, what this possibly suggests is that fluctuations in vacancy creation are driving unemployment dynamics, driving the increase in unemployment during recessions. But however, when we look at other countries, this doesn't always seem to be the case. And for example, Sweden seems to be the exact opposite. So Sweden, fluctuations and separations drive the majority of the rise in unemployment during recessions. So what it suggests is that maybe labour markets just behave very differently once recessions hit. So understanding which of these margins is most important is fundamental to our understanding of how recessions impact labour markets. So but in this paper, instead of just focusing on the average worker, so sort of a representative agent, what I'm going to be thinking about is comparing between males and females, and as I said at the start, trying to understand why one gender experiences greater volatility in unemployment relative to the other, greater increases in unemployment relative to the other. So the basic facts are presented in the table, and so what the numbers show are, so it's the variance in the percentage change. This is for 18 countries using data from the OECD. So what these numbers show is that the variance in the percentage change, loosely speaking, to a close approximation, the variance of the percentage change in the male unemployment rate divided by the variance in the percentage change in the female unemployment rate. And so let's just, loosely speaking, let's just describe these as volatilities of unemployment. What you find is that these ratios are mostly greater than 1 apart from Luxembourg. So what that says is that, okay, males in general, the volatility of unemployment is greater for males relative to females. And this is data over the last, at least sort of over the last 4 decades or so, yeah, using OECD. So there's this fact that seems to be present in labor markets, such as males experience greater volatility. We can look at in unemployment. We can look at specific countries, and so for this audience, we'll look at Ireland first. And what you find is that, sorry, is there a question? No. What you find is that, okay, in Ireland, in the Great Recession, the male unemployment rate skyrocketed to almost 18% in, I think it's 2011. This is relative to the female unemployment rate only, so I say the increase, but only rising to 13%. And so the question is, which flow is contributing to this much greater increase in unemployment for males relative to females? You can look at other countries. So UK, again, you see that, so the red here, sorry, the red is the male, blue is female. What we see is, again, males seem to experience greater increases in unemployment in recessions relative to females. And we'll finally look at another country, so the US, and again, we see the same basic point, is that males seem to be hit hardest when recessions hit across many countries, and in fact, all the countries that we're studying. There's been interest from a few outlets, quite a few outlets during the Great Recession, which from The Economist and New York Times, we started using this term called sort of man sessions to describe recessions because they seem to hit males hardest. Now, there may be some differences during the current recession, as I said at the start, that I will get back to later on if there's people to talk about that. Okay, so the basic question is, why do males and females exhibit different unemployment dynamics? In general, in the context of recession, is it because the male separation rate increases more than the female separation rate? Because the male job finding rate falls more than the female job finding rate? Or is it some combination of the two? And what's going to be nice about this work is you tend not to find with regards to looking across countries, you tend not to find, as I said at the start, labor markets respond very differently when recessions hit. But what's going to be nice about this work is we're going to find this one story that's consistent across all countries, which you don't really see when you're looking at cross-country analysis, and something we're sort of excited about with this work. Okay, so all the differences in the reason between countries, I've basically said there's not going to be, there's going to be one nice story. And then we're going to also provide an explanation, and that's a natural explanation. We're going to test a sort of natural explanation for why one gender experiences greater volatility in one particular flow. And we're going to ask, why do we observe differences in cyclicality of the important flow by gender? Okay, so hopefully this is sort of the rubric of the talk, and hopefully this is clear. Okay, so I'm going to describe some of the literature and how our paper our results fit into this literature. So in 2005 and 2012, there's two important papers by Hall and Scheimer, who was going against the conventional wisdom that job destruction is the key thing that drives unemployment in recessions. But prior to these papers, the story was that when recessions hit, lots of workers lose their jobs. Okay, job finding isn't really affected so much. But these papers say that, okay, actually, the story is actually completely opposite. So in the US, at least, unemployment variation is driven by large reductions in job finding for individuals. And also, Ellsby et al., as I've already described, says that there are large differences in the contributions of separations in job findings across countries. And so labor markets respond very differently across countries. And so maybe this reflects interesting differences in institutions and policy. And we're not going to say too much about what, these they go into the different these institutions and policy answers, but we can do this in future work. Okay, so what do we find? We find when comparing between males and females, we find the exact opposite result to the US. And so this is consistent, and this result is consistent across all 18 countries in the study. And the result is that the separation margin, dynamics in the separation margin seem to be really important for the dynamics of the gender unemployment gap. And so this is important because in past work, with theory, there's been a sort of move to think about only using acyclical separation rates. And of course, if the dynamics of the gender unemployment gap is driven by differing fluctuations in separation, then this acyclical separation rate that's often used in theory to understand business cycles is incomplete. Okay, so separations are an important feature of unemployment dynamics. Abanasi and Sahin in 2017, they showed that the sector composition is important in explaining the large rise in unemployment for males during recessions in the US. And you can think this is a natural story, and there's been a lot of talk about this with the current recession, and maybe explaining why this time it's different. What we find is for 25 countries in the OECD, it does seem like this sector composition story is a candidate explanation for the larger variation in unemployment for males and females. So we sort of, the contribution here is to show that this sector story, and I'll explain how I show that this is the case soon. The sector story seems to be an important, important factor. There are also two other papers here that I just cite that also do look at this flows-based analysis and look at the gender unemployment gap. Okay. If there are any important questions that maybe I could answer now, I'm happy to wait till the end. So the goal now is to estimate these flows, so estimate the separations or unemployment inflows, and estimate these job finding rates or unemployment outflows. So how do we do this? And so what we're doing is just following Ellsby et al. In 2013. So begin with the basic equation describing changes in unemployment. Okay, so changes in unemployment at time t is just equal to, it's in continuous time, is equal to the separation rate multiplied by the proportion of the labor force who are not in unemployment, minus the job finding rate multiplied by the unemployment rate. So the difference in these two flows describes how unemployment changes over time. What we can do is solve this differential equation forward by 1 year exactly, where we're going to assume that these separations and job finding rates do not change within the year. Okay, and when we do this, what we can write down is unemployment as a function of what it was in the past and some stuff in the middle. What is this stuff in the middle? Well, what you can see is that this ratio turns out, and if any of you know labor economics and in undergrad, this is the steady state unemployment rate. What is the steady state unemployment rate? Well, it's the unemployment rate where we set changes equal to 0. And so this steady state comes out. So unemployment at time t is a function of the steady state unemployment rate, but also how it was in the past. Notice just to sort of show how it's important to be understanding what these sort of out of steady state dynamics is the last term. Notice that what really governs whether the steady state approximation to the unemployment is a good one is whether the separation and job finding rates are large. Notice that when ST and FT get really large here, the unemployment rate is really well approximated by the steady state, but when they're low, these out of steady state dynamics are really important. Okay, and so what we're going to see for these, well, actually not going to show you the size of these flows, but it's really important when you're looking at countries other than the US, or the US has really high flow rates. It's really important to be taking into account these non-steady state, these out of steady state dynamics when we're calculating these flows. Okay, so we have this equation that's where we have the unemployment rates at time t and 12 months prior. And so we want to use this equation somehow to calculate these flows. So how do we do this? Well, we have one equation and two unknowns. That's no good. So what we want to do is somehow estimate outside this equation one of these flow rates. How do we do this? What we can do is use a measure of unemployment duration in the data I'm going to describe in a second. And so unemployment at time t+1 minus unemployment at time t, so changes in unemployment, discrete time now, is equal to the proportion of the labor force who was in unemployment for less than 1 month. So it's just short-term unemployment, and it just represents all workers who have just landed in unemployment. Okay, so it's just a measure of this separations in the economy. And then minus the job finding probability times unemployment. We can then solve for the job finding probability, and then given the workers find jobs following the Poisson process, the underlying hazard rate is just given as the following. Okay, so essentially we can calculate these job finding rates and then plug them into this equation, and then we can just calculate ST numerically. One equation, one unknown, that's straightforward. Okay, so we can use this framework to just calculate these flows across many countries, and also importantly by gender. What is the data source that we're using to do this? It's just the OECD, the data from the OECD. And so aggregate data, so the OECD provides information on all the things that we need. The two main things are just the unemployment rate over time, and also this measure of unemployment duration for less than 1 month. So we're going to do this for 18 countries over the past 4 decades or so, and also split by gender. So, and what I'm not going to talk about too much is we're going to make use of all data on unemployment durations to overcome possible small samples that make this measure of unemployment duration relatively noisy in countries that aren't so dynamic. But that's sort of not so important with regards to the results, but just sort of robustness and making these more accurate. We use all information on unemployment durations as following Elsevier et al. So what do we get? So here is just all these 18 countries, and I'm just showing you the relative size of these flows for males relative to females. And so if you look down this column, what you find is that separations seem to be bigger for females across all countries. And with regards to job finding, you don't see this clear difference. Now, the problem with what's the possible interpretation here? The interpretation might be that job loss is just larger in general for females. Now, this conclusion would be inaccurate, and the reason is because the measure that we're using to calculate these flows is this unemployment duration measure. And so those in unemployment for less than 1 month. These incorporate two sets of people. Those who have just moved from employment to unemployment, so separations, but it also does include those workers who've just entered the labor force. And so these differences in inflows by males and females could represent just differences in the participation margin. Okay, so you shouldn't look at this and then say, okay, it's the case definitely that female job loss is larger than male job loss. More related to this work, though, is understanding how these things change over time. Here, I'm just showing you just an example period, which is just the Great Recession. So I think it was between 2007 and 2009. What you find is just looking at the average. I highlight Ireland here, Ireland in the UK. What we find is if you look at the average, what this says is that the percentage change in the separation rate or the unemployment inflow rate was larger for males relative to females. And then looking at the broad average, it's probably not great to do this, but just for the purposes of exposition, the job finding rate, there doesn't seem to be such differences and changes in the job finding rate during recessions for males relative to females. And so what this suggests is that the separation margin is probably going to be most important. Okay. So taking stock, what have we seen so far? I've estimated time series of job separations or unemployment inflows and job finding or unemployment outflows for all 18 countries by gender. And on with these time series, we can now assess which flow is most important in contributing to unemployment variation by gender. And we're going to focus on the Great Recession soon as well. Focus on recessionary periods soon. And then importantly, study which flow is the culprit for the larger volatility of unemployment for males relative to females. Okay. So what we're going to do then is using this equation that I described to you, the unemployment dynamics out of steady state. What we want to do is use that to think of a decomposition where we're looking at changes. We want to decompose changes in unemployment over time. So what we can do is take a log linear approximation of this equation that was described to you before around the previous period flows and steady state. And this just gives you a decomposition of unemployment into the contributions due to the underlying flow rates. And so changes in unemployment at time t are equal to this first term here, and this just says, okay, some of these changes are due to changes in the separation rate, and some are due to changes in the job finding rate. But we also have these out of steady state dynamics explained by this final term. Okay, so we can just look at, if we wanted to just look at the contributions that are due to change in the separations, we just portion out this effect in here. And if we want to look at the contributions that are due to changes in job finding, we'll just portion out the effect here shown by this equation. Okay, so then the contribution of inflows, for example, to changes in unemployment is therefore given as the following. So notice that we're just portioning out the contribution that due to separations here, but also we have these out of steady state dynamics that are explained by this final term. So they just say how are separations drive? So in the context of recession, what is the contribution of separations to the rise in unemployment during recessions? This is what these contributions describe. And we can summarize these overall results and just do a simple variance decomposition. So what we have is the covariance of the changes in unemployment with the contributions divided by the overall variance in the changes in unemployment. And we can just summarize the overall effect of changes in separations with these betas. I'm going to explain exactly what the interpretation is in the next slide of these numbers. So here I'm not, just to make it clear, here I'm not, so I should speed up. Here I'm not looking at differences between genders. Here I'm just focusing on one gender and looking at one gender and then looking at another gender, okay? So what do we find? So just with regards to interpretation, let's focus on Australia for now. What this says is that changes in job finding drive 37% of the dynamics of unemployment for Australia, for males in Australia. And changes in job separations drive 2/3 of unemployment variation for males in Australia. So it seems like for males at least, job destruction seems to be the most important reason. Fluctuations in job destruction, rise in job destruction during recessions seem to be the most important explanation for increased unemployment in recessions. But for females, sorry, we find that, okay, these two contributions are about equal. Okay, so here, 53% of unemployment variation is driven by changes in job finding and 48% is due to changes in job separations. I just want to just focus on two countries here and just show you how different labor markets seem to respond to the business cycle, be affected by the business cycle. Just focusing on males, for Italy, job finding drives about 3/4 of unemployment variation. And so it seems like fluctuations in vacancy creation are possibly most important for Italy. But for Netherlands, the complete opposite is true. About 3/4 are driven by fluctuations in separations. So maybe fluctuations in job destruction are most important. And perhaps what the underlying reason for this is in the institutional setting and the associated policies in these countries. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but the main takeaway here is that, okay, as shown by Ellsby et al., there's very different, labor markets seem to be affected very differently across countries. And just showing you Ireland and the UK for the audience, let's just focus on actually the UK. I now want to compare between males and females. What you tend to find in these numbers is that for females, job finding seems to be, sorry, for males, separations seem to be more important than for females. And we can see the stark example for the UK. So in general, job finding and job separation seem to be most important for males in the UK, but for females, the job finding, fluctuations in job finding are the key driver behind unemployment dynamics. Okay, so now, so the takeaway is here, labor markets respond very differently across countries, and job separations are possibly more important. It's not always the case, but job separations seem to be more important for males relative to females. Now, what I want to do is what we're really interested in is thinking about the gender unemployment gap. Okay, so we're going to decompose now not just the unemployment rates for males and females, but now just focusing solely on the gender unemployment gap. And so the gap that we're going to describe is just the log of unemployment, the log of unemployment gap. And so it's a log of unemployment for males relative to the log of unemployment for females. Okay. Taking differences of this equation, we just have that this changes in this gap are just equal to the percentage change in the male unemployment rate minus the percentage change in the female unemployment rate. And so notice that we know how to decompose this, the changes in unemployment for males, we know how to decompose changes in unemployment for females. And so therefore, since we can decompose each of these individually, we can decompose the dynamics of the gender unemployment gap. Okay, and so the contributions of variations, and so I'm going to use the terminology inflow gap and outflow gap. So changes in the inflow gap, so differing fluctuations in inflows for males relative to females, that's the inflow gap. And the outflow gap is differing fluctuations in outflows for males relative to females, the outflow gap. Okay, so the percentage contribution of variations in the inflow gap to fluctuations in the unemployment gap is calculated as the following in the same manner. Again, I'm going to be clear on what I mean with the interpretation. Okay, so these are the results. Just focusing on Australia again, so for interpretation, what it says is that 24% of the fluctuations in the outflow gap drive, fluctuations in the outflow gap drive 24% of the dynamics of the gender unemployment gap, but 80% of the fluctuations in the gender unemployment gap are explained by changes in the gender inflow gap, gender separation gap. If you look down the second column, you find that this separation margin, this inflow gap margin, seems to be the most important thing, most important margin for explaining why it is the case that the male unemployment rate seems to rise more in recessions relative to females, why the male unemployment rate is more volatile for males relative to females. So these numbers are all sort of close to 1. So beta S, this second column, these numbers are all really close to 1. Not always the case. So France is maybe an outlier, but in general, these numbers are all really close to 1. And so, again, fluctuations in the inflow gap are driving the majority of the volatility of the gender unemployment gap. Yeah, so here, just highlighting Ireland and the UK again. So for Ireland, it's just all due to the larger fluctuations, these larger increases in unemployment during recessions are all essentially due to just males being larger increases in separations for males relative to females. And again, the same for the UK. This is, just before I move on, this is really nice because it just says when you tend to look across countries, you find, the labor markets respond very differently. But when we're comparing between males and females, we find this one consistent reason as to why one gender experiences greater volatility relative to the other, greater volatility in unemployment relative to the other. Here's just the average, and you can see that on average, okay, all of the dynamics are due to the inflow gap. What I want to do now is just do some graphical analysis and just focus just on the Great Recession. We do also in the paper all the recessionary periods, but I just focus on the Great Recession. And so what do we have? On the black line just is the gender unemployment gap during the Great Recession, so 2007 to 2012. And so what we have on the red line is the contribution due to larger increase in inflows for males relative to females. Again, so the fact that these are positive means that the percentage increase in the male unemployment rate was greater than the percentage increase in the female unemployment rate. Okay, and so we have the contributions that are due to the inflow gap and the contributions that are due to the outflow gap. Okay, so the red line plus the blue line should equal approximately the black line. What we find here is that for most countries, the inflow gap is most important. Again, for Ireland, in line with the numbers I've just described to you, the inflow gap seems really important in driving the larger increase for males, larger increase in unemployment for males relative to females. And again, the inflow gap seems to be most important. It's not to say that the outflow gap is not important at all, but it's just the most important margin that we should be thinking about when we're thinking about gender unemployment dynamics does seem to be the inflow gap, dynamics of the inflow gap. Okay, I'll maybe come to this later on because I'm not sure how long I've got actually, but come to this later on. We do some sort of robustness stuff, and we can talk about these things. In particular, what about the participation entry margin? Also, I talked about the percentage change in the male unemployment rate minus the percentage change in the female unemployment rate. Maybe we're just interested in the changes in these things as opposed to percentage changes. And looking at different time periods as well, we maybe want to, we'll come back to these at the end if there are any questions regarding these. Okay, so taking stock, what do we find? Unemployment dynamics seem to be very different across countries. Unemployment inflows seem to be more important for males and females, but importantly, variations in the unemployment inflow gap, separation gap, seem to drive the dynamics of the gender unemployment gap across all countries understood. Okay, so what we're going to do now is go towards a possible underlying mechanism that's driving these differing dynamics of the most important margin, which is the inflows. And so what we want to, the natural explanation is this sectoral composition story. And so for Albanasi and Sahin in 2018 show that if you assign the male industry composition to the female labor force in the US, the rise in the unemployment gap drops by a half, okay? So at least this sectoral story seems to be really important in the US. So is the sectoral story consistent across a wide range of countries? That's what we want to do now. So how are we going to test whether this is the case? Is this sector, there's a candidate explanation, the sectoral story. So what we're going to do is collect data on output by sector and also the gender shares by sector, okay? And then we're going to regress aggregate output on output by sector, and we're going to use the coefficient as our measure of the cyclicality of that sector's output. And so if the candidate explanation is the sectoral composition story, we should expect that output in male-dominated sectors should be more cyclical than output in female-dominated sectors. Okay, so on the horizontal axis, I'm showing you. So what is this figure showing? So it's the blue dots represent a sector within a country. Okay, so these are 25 countries here. They're listed below, and the blue dot represents a sector within a country. And the horizontal axis is a male sector share, and the vertical axis is sort of this measure of cyclicality that we're using, the measure of the cyclicality of that sector's output. And what we find is this positive association. So as the male sector share increases, the cyclicality of that sector's output also increases. And so males seem to be, at least on average, across all countries here, using just all countries in a regression, we find that, okay, males seem to be hired into sectors that are more cyclical, more susceptible to economic swings. What we can do is look at individual countries. So Ireland, for example. So female-dominated sectors, professional, scientific, administrative, are dominated by females, and their cyclicality of that sector's output is relatively small. But for manufacturing, which is dominated by males, the cyclicality of that sector's output is really large. A similar result for the UK in construction, manufacturing industry dominated by females, and the cyclicality of those sectors' output seems to be really, really large. But for public administration, health, education, which are dominated by females, the cyclicality is almost zero. And finally, for the US, again, same basic results, and we see these results across all countries that we look at. I think there's one outlier, which is Greece, which is strange. But yeah, in general, we find this positive association. Construction, manufacturing dominated by males, cyclicality of that sector's output is strong. And healthcare and social assistance, education dominated by females. If anything, the cyclicality is actually negative, which is interesting here. Again, we find this positive association that suggests that the sectoral story, the sectoral composition story, is a really is a good explanation behind the sectoral composition is important in the gender unemployment dynamics story. So what's nice about this work is we found these sort of consistent results, which you don't tend to see when you're looking across countries. When these labor markets behave very differently when you're looking at a sort of representative agent. But when you're comparing between males and females, it seems like there's a clear story that's likely to be really important. So males sort into sectors that are more susceptible to economic swings. This in turn means, so when I say sort, I shouldn't really say sort. Males are hired into sectors that are more susceptible to economic swings. This in turn means the average precarity of male jobs increases more in recessions relative to females, which in turn increases the unemployment inflow more for males relative to females. And so this story, as I said, is sort of a candid explanation for these gender unemployment dynamics that are consistent across all 18 countries that we study in the OECD. Okay, so in the context of a DM, just the last few moments, I'm just going to talk briefly about sort of the DMP framework and how this would sort of fit into DMP framework. So if we had a model, it's clearly the job destruction margin is important, right? And so I'm just gonna sort of talk about these two different ways that you can have job destruction in the model, and one is just an exogenous job destruction, and maybe just force the job destruction rate to increase for a period and then fall back down. Or maybe you can have endogenous job destruction. Maybe this lends more towards what I've discussed in this paper. So maybe with exogenous job destruction, you could get these results that I've described in this world by just saying that, okay, maybe there's two sectors, one where it's dominated by males and one dominated by females, and you just say that we see in the data that the male-dominated sector experiences a greater increase in the job destruction rate in recessions. Now, maybe this is a way you could do it, but maybe it's incomplete and maybe it's not so interesting. With regards to the endogenous job destruction story, I think this is more aligned with what I've described to you. Okay, so the problem with this endogenous job destruction, so there's idiosyncratic shocks, and maybe these results in these endogenous decisions to destroy a job in this DMP framework. The problem with this, though, is that if output is more cyclical in male-dominated sectors, then this should also affect the job finding margin. Okay, so it should if output falls more in male-dominated sectors, it should firstly also increase job destruction. Okay, forgetting about issues such as wage rigidities for now. But it should also increase job destruction, but also reduce the incentive to post vacancies in these sectors, and also resulting large increase in job finding in the model. And this isn't necessarily consistent in the data in what I've just described to you. Job finding seems to fall by a similar amount for males relative to females. So maybe one candidate is something like where there's some switching in the sectors that males are searching for in recession. So that maybe they lose their jobs and they move over to sort of the vacancies that are available, and these are sort of more female-dominated sectors. So maybe something we're thinking about maybe in the future is just, do males move to more female-dominated sectors in recessions following job loss, which would be consistent. If this is the case, this would be consistent with whatever the results that I described to you over the past 40 minutes. And I think I'm just going to finish that. So recent work has outlined that separations are unimportant for the story of unemployment dynamics, and has resulted in a large amount of theory being conducted under this premise. We show in this paper that when concerned with the dynamics of the gender unemployment gap, in fact, the opposite is true and consistent among a large group of countries, okay? So it seems like, okay, separation margin is the most important thing for the dynamics of the gender unemployment gap. We showed that a candidate explanation for this result is the gender composition by sector. And so this leads us to this simple story that's consistent across many countries. And the takeaway is, the important takeaway here is in order to understand why the gender unemployment gap changes over time and why the male unemployment rate rises more in recessions relative to females, one generally only needs to understand why one gender has a more volatile inflow rate than the other. And I am just about finished. Very happy to take questions. Thank you.